The Valorian mining colony on Nexara 7 had been burning for 17 days. The fires had started when the first bombs fell from the sky, and they had not stopped since. Smoke rose from broken buildings and covered the sun until day looked like night. The people of this small colony had done nothing wrong. They were miners and farmers. They had families and children. They had dreams of a peaceful life on this quiet world far from the troubles of the galaxy. But peace was not something the Corvan Empire cared about. Commander Xylith stood on the bridge of his warship and watched the destruction below with cold satisfaction. His mandibles clicked together as he gave orders to his officers. He was a tall creature with dark armored skin and eyes that held no warmth. He had conquered 12 worlds before this one. He had never lost a battle. The Valorians were weak and gentle beings who ate only plants and knew nothing of war. They were perfect victims. The Corvan fleet numbered 40 warships. Each one bristled with weapons that could turn cities to ash in seconds. They had surrounded the planet and cut off all escape routes. No one was coming to help these people. No one cared enough to try. In the last standing shelter dome on the planet's surface, 8,000 Valorians huddled together in fear. They had sent distress signals into space for weeks. They had begged the Galactic Council for help. They had pleaded with neighboring civilizations to send ships. The answers had all been the same. The Council had declared their system strategically unimportant. Their neighbors had closed their borders and looked away. As far as the rest of the galaxy was concerned, these 8,000 souls were already dead. Elder Vorath was the leader of this colony. He was old and tired, and his hope had died days ago. He walked among his people and tried to comfort them, but his words felt empty. The children cried for food that was running out. The wounded moaned in pain as medical supplies dwindled to nothing. Mothers held their young ones close, and fathers stared at the walls with hollow eyes. They were all just waiting to die. Vorath had prayed to the old gods of his people. He had begged the spirits of his ancestors for help. But the skies remained dark and full of enemy ships. No salvation was coming. The universe had looked at his people and decided they were not worth saving. Then something changed. A sensor officer on Commander Xylith's flagship detected a new signature emerging from hyperspace. It was just one ship. A single vessel that looked old and worn and battle-scarred. Its hull was covered in markings that no one in this sector had ever seen before. A blue and green sphere on a field of black dotted with white stars. The ship broadcast its identification in a language that had to be translated. Earth Vessel Resolute, requesting communication with Corvan Command. Xylith's officers looked at each other in confusion. Earth was a young world on the far edge of known space. Humans were newcomers to the galactic community. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel a century ago. What was one of their ships doing here in a war zone so far from their home? The commander opened a channel, and his voice dripped with amusement. "Human vessel, you have entered restricted space. Leave now, or be destroyed. This is your only warning." There was a pause. Then a human voice responded. It was calm and steady, and held no fear. "This is Captain Daniel Shaw of the Earth Vessel Resolute. We have received distress signals from the Valorian colony below. We are here to render assistance. We ask that you withdraw your forces and allow humanitarian aid to reach these people." Xylith laughed. The sound was harsh and cruel. "One ship? You bring one ship against my fleet of 40? Human, I do not know if your species is brave or simply stupid, but I will enjoy teaching you the difference." Daniel Shaw stood on the bridge of the Resolute and listened to the alien commander's threats. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair that was starting to show gray at the temples. His uniform was neat, but worn from years of service. His eyes were tired but determined. He had served in 3 conflicts before this one. He had seen what happened when good people did nothing while innocents suffered. Beside him stood Lieutenant Katie Monroe. She was younger than the captain by 15 years, but she had proven herself many times over. Her red hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her fingers moved across her console as she analyzed the enemy fleet. The numbers were not good. They were not good at all. "Captain," she said quietly so the rest of the bridge crew would not hear. "Command has not authorized this intervention. We are technically violating 3 treaties just by being here. If we engage these ships, Earth could face serious diplomatic consequences. Daniel did not take his eyes off the view screen. Through the smoke and fire, he could see the shelter dome below. 8,000 people were trapped down there. 8,000 people who had asked for help and been ignored by everyone else in the galaxy. He thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was 10 years old and loved to look at the stars. He thought about what he would want someone to do if she was the one trapped in that dome. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be when he looked in the mirror. "Katie," he said, "how many crew do we have on board?" 217, sir. "And how many people are down there in that colony?" "Sensors indicate approximately 8,000, sir." Daniel nodded slowly. "So if we do nothing, 8,000 people die today, and we go home safe and sound and live with that knowledge for the rest of our lives." Katie was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened her shoulders and her jaw set firm. "What are your orders, Captain?" Daniel Shaw looked at his crew. They were scared. They knew the odds. They knew they were about to fly into a fight they probably could not win. But not one of them suggested they turn around and leave. Not one of them said these strangers were not worth the risk. He felt something like pride swell in his chest. This was why he had joined the fleet. This was what humanity was supposed to be about. "Sound general quarters," he ordered. "All hands to battle stations. Launch the drop pods on my command. Tell the Marines we have civilians to protect." The alarms began to wail throughout the ship. Boots pounded on metal floors as men and women ran to their positions. In the cargo bay, 48 soldiers in dark armor checked their weapons and said quiet prayers. On the planet below, Elder Vorath heard one of his people cry out. He pushed through the crowd to reach the observation window. There in the dark sky above, a single ship was moving toward the Corvan fleet. Its engines blazed with light as it accelerated into certain death. "What are they doing?" someone whispered. "They will be destroyed." Vorath did not answer. He could not explain what he was seeing. He could not understand why anyone would throw their lives away for strangers they had never met. But for the first time in 17 days, he felt something stir in his chest. Something he had forgotten was possible. Hope. The Corvan fleet did not take the humans seriously at first. Commander Xylith watched the lone Earth ship approach his armada and felt only amusement. This was not a battle. This was an insect flying toward a fire. He ordered his gunners to hold their fire for a moment longer. He wanted to savor this. He wanted to watch these foolish humans realize their mistake before he erased them from existence. Then the Resolute's cargo bay doors opened, and everything changed. Sergeant Ryan Cole was the first man out of the drop pod. He hit alien soil before the dust had settled and rolled into a combat crouch with his rifle raised. The air smelled like smoke and burning metal. The ground beneath his boots was scorched and cracked from orbital bombardment. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the screams of frightened civilians. Behind him came 47 more Marines from the 3rd Orbital Division. They landed in a wide pattern around the shelter dome and immediately formed defensive positions. Every single one of them had volunteered for this mission. Every single one of them knew the odds. Captain Shaw had been very clear when he addressed them in the cargo bay. "This is a one-way trip. We are going down there to protect those people. We will hold the line until reinforcements arrive or until we can no longer hold it. Anyone who wants to stay on the ship can do so with no shame." Not one Marine had stayed behind. Ryan Cole was 34 years old. He had been a soldier for 12 of those years. He had fought in border skirmishes and peacekeeping missions, and one very bad month on a moon where the enemy had outnumbered them 10-1. He had been shot twice and stabbed once, and had lost count of the friends he had buried. But he had never felt more certain about anything than he felt right now. The Valorians watched in stunned silence as these strange creatures in dark armor surrounded their shelter. The humans were tall and walked upright on 2 legs, their faces were flat, and their eyes were forward-facing like predators. They moved with a kind of coordination that was almost frightening. Every step was precise. Every motion had purpose. Elder Vorath pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He did not understand what he was seeing. These beings had come from nowhere. They had dropped from the sky like stones. And now they were standing between his people and the enemy, as if they meant to fight. One of the humans approached him. It was a female with dark skin and kind eyes. She held no weapon in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "My name is Corporal Megan Torres," she said. "We are here to help you. Please keep your people inside the shelter and stay away from the windows. Things are going to get loud." Vorath found his voice. "You cannot be serious. There are thousands of enemy soldiers in orbit. You have fewer than 50 warriors. This is madness." Megan smiled at him. It was a strange expression that showed her teeth. Among many species, such a display would be a threat. But somehow the Valorian understood that this was meant to be reassuring. "We are not here to win, sir. We are here to buy you time. Reinforcements are coming. We just need to hold until they arrive." "How long?" Megan's smile faded just a little. "We do not know. But we will hold as long as we can." Above them, the battle had begun. The Resolute twisted and rolled through space as Corvan weapons fire streaked past her hull. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Price worked the weapons console with desperate speed. His fingers flew across the controls as he targeted enemy ships and returned fire. The Resolute was old, and her weapons were not as powerful as the Corvan guns. But Nathan was very good at his job, and he made every shot count. Captain Daniel Shaw gripped the arms of his command chair as the ship shook from a near miss. Damage reports were coming in from all over the vessel. Hull breaches on Deck 7. Fires in engineering. The port shield generator was failing. They had been in the fight for less than 10 minutes, and already his ship was falling apart. "Status report," he called out. Katie Monroe checked her console. 3 enemy ships disabled. 2 more damaged. "We have taken hits to our starboard engine and forward weapons array. Shields at 40% and dropping." Daniel did a quick calculation in his head. At this rate they would be destroyed within the hour. But every minute they survived was another minute for those people on the ground. Every enemy ship they damaged was one less threat to the Marines below. "Keep firing," he ordered. "Target their weapon systems. Make them work for every shot." On the planet's surface, the first wave of Corvan ground troops had arrived. They came in heavy dropships that screamed through the atmosphere and crashed down in clouds of dust and fire. The soldiers that emerged were big and heavily armored. They carried weapons that could punch through walls. They numbered in the hundreds. Sergeant Cole watched them approach through the scope of his rifle. He counted at least 300 enemy soldiers moving toward their position. His own force had 48 Marines plus whatever civilians could hold a weapon. The math was not encouraging. He opened a channel to his squad. "Remember your training. Pick your targets. Make every shot count. We hold this line, no matter what." The first shots were fired and the battle for the shelter dome began. Corporal Megan Torres had taken up a position near the main entrance. Beside her crouched a young Valorian male who had refused to go inside with the others. He was barely an adult by his species standards. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were determined. "You should be inside with your family," Megan told him. The young Valorian shook his head. "My family is dead. The bombs took them on the first day. I have nothing left to lose." Megan looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pack and pulled out a spare sidearm. It was a simple weapon, easy to use. She pressed it into his trembling hands. "Stay behind me. Point this at anything that is not human or Valorian. Squeeze the trigger. Do not think. Just act." The young male nodded. "What is your name, human?" "Megan." "What is yours?" "Talith." "Okay, Talith. Today, you and I are going to keep your people alive. Are you ready?" Talith looked at the weapon in his hands. Then he looked at the smoke rising in the distance where the enemy was advancing. Then he looked at Megan with something new in his eyes, something that had not been there before. "I am ready." The first Corvan soldiers came over the ridge and Megan raised her rifle. She sighted down the barrel and let out a slow breath. Beside her, Talith did the same with his borrowed pistol. The night exploded into fire and thunder. In orbit, Commander Xylith received reports that his ground forces were meeting resistance. He scoffed at the news. A handful of humans against his elite troops? They would be crushed within the hour, but an hour passed. Then 2. And still the reports came in. The humans were holding. Somehow, against all logic and reason, these strange creatures from a distant world were holding the line. Xylith stopped laughing. For the first time since the battle began, he felt something cold settle in his stomach. What were these humans made of? By the 6th hour of battle, the Marines had lost 11 soldiers. Their bodies lay where they had fallen because there was no time to move them. The living could not stop to mourn the dead. The enemy kept coming, and the line had to hold. Sergeant Ryan Cole knelt beside the body of Private First Class Derek Huang. The kid had been 19 years old. He had grown up on a farm in the middle of America and had joined the Marines because he wanted to see the stars. Now he would never see anything again. A Corvon plasma bolt had caught him in the chest and ended his life in an instant. Cole closed the young man's eyes with gentle fingers. He allowed himself 3 seconds to feel the grief. Then he locked it away in a dark corner of his mind where it could not slow him down. There would be time for mourning later. If there was a later. Fall back to secondary positions, he ordered through his communication unit. Everyone regroup at the east barricade. And someone tell the Resolute, we need air support. On the ship above, things were not going well. The Resolute had taken heavy damage. Half her weapons were offline. Her shields had failed completely. Fires burned in 3 different sections, and the crew was running out of ways to put them out. The hull was scarred and torn from dozens of direct hits. Any other ship would have been destroyed hours ago, but Lieutenant Katie Monroe refused to let her ship die. She worked at her console with burned and blistered hands. An electrical fire had broken out near her station an hour ago. She had put it out with her bare palms because there was no time to find an extinguisher. The pain was constant, but she ignored it. Pain was just information. It could not stop her unless she let it. Katie, Captain Shaw called out. I need you to reroute power from life support on decks 4 through 7. Katie was already doing it. Her fingers danced across the controls. Nobody is using those decks anyway, sir. We sealed them off after the hull breaches. Good thinking. You can buy me a drink when we get home, Captain. Daniel Shaw allowed himself a small smile despite everything. If we get home, Lieutenant, neither of them said what they were both thinking. The chances of survival were getting smaller by the minute, but they kept fighting anyway because that was who they were. That was what humans did. On the ground, the situation had grown desperate. Commander Xylith had grown tired of watching his forces struggle against a handful of enemies. He ordered his elite shock troops deployed. The Crimson Guard were the finest warriors in the Corvan Empire. They had fought in 100 battles and never known defeat. 300 of them dropped from orbit in black pods that hit the ground like fists. Sergeant Cole watched them emerge from their landing craft. These soldiers were different from the others. They were bigger. Their armor was heavier. They moved with a kind of terrible grace that spoke of years of training and experience. These were not ordinary troops. These were killers. He counted the enemy force, and then counted his own remaining Marines. 36 humans, against 300 Crimson Guard. The math had been bad before. Now, it was impossible. But impossible had never stopped a Marine. All units, Cole said into his communicator. Dig in. Hold your positions. We do not retreat. We do not surrender. We hold this line until our last breath. Is that understood? 35 voices answered him. Yes, Sergeant. The Crimson Guard advanced, and the bloodiest phase of the battle began. Corporal Megan Torres had not slept in 30 hours. Her body ached from exhaustion and her ammunition was running low. Beside her, the young Valorian, named Talith, had proven himself surprisingly capable. He had shot 3 enemy soldiers with his borrowed pistol and had not flinched once. Behind them in the shelter dome, Elder Voreth was organizing the last of the evacuation. Underground tunnels had been discovered beneath the colony. They were old mining shafts that had been abandoned decades ago. The civilians were being moved into them one group at a time. It was slow work, but it was their only hope. Vorath found Megan during a brief lull in the fighting. He grabbed her arm with trembling fingers, and his old eyes searched her face with desperate confusion. Why? He asked. His voice cracked with emotion. We are nothing to you humans. We have no strategic value. We cannot repay this debt. Why do you fight for us? Megan was quiet for a moment. She thought about her grandmother who had survived a terrible storm because strangers came to help dig her out of the rubble. She thought about her father who had been a firefighter and had run into burning buildings to save people he had never met. She thought about all the stories she had grown up hearing, stories about people who saw someone in trouble and did not look away. She thought about what it meant to be human, because someone has to, she said finally, and no one else was coming. Vorath stared at her. In all his long years he had never encountered a species like this one. The galaxy was full of civilizations that valued profit and power, and self-interest above all else. The strong took from the weak and called it natural. No one helped strangers without expecting something in return. But these humans had come to die for people they had never met. They asked for nothing. They expected nothing. They simply saw suffering and could not look away. You are either the most noble species in the galaxy, Vorath whispered, or the most foolish. Megan smiled tiredly. Maybe we are both. The Crimson Guard hit their lines like a wave crashing against rocks. The fighting became close and brutal. Marines fell, but they took enemies with them. The Valorian defenders fought alongside their human protectors with borrowed weapons and desperate courage. Private Amy Lynn held her position even after a plasma bolt took her left arm off at the elbow. She propped her rifle on a broken wall and kept shooting until she passed out from blood loss. Corporal Marcus Webb dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire, and then went back for a 4th. He did not make it, but the soldiers he saved would remember his name forever. And in the center of it all, Sergeant Ryan Cole stood like a pillar of stone. His armor was scorched. His rifle was nearly empty. Blood ran down his face from a wound he did not remember receiving. But he did not fall. He did not break. He held the line, because that was what Marines did. The Crimson Guard had never faced anything like this. They were used to enemies who broke and ran when the odds turned against them. These humans did not break. They did not run. They fought with a ferocity that was almost frightening. For the first time in their existence, the undefeated Crimson Guard began to doubt. And somewhere in the void of space, a message was speeding toward Earth. A message from a dying ship and its desperate crew. A message that said only one thing: we need help. Send everyone. Commander Xylith was preparing his victory speech when his sensor officer made a sound he had never heard before. It was a noise of pure terror, the kind of sound a creature makes when it sees something that should not exist. Commander, the officer stammered. New contacts emerging from hyperspace. Xylith turned to the tactical display with annoyance. He expected to see a few more human ships, perhaps 5 or 10 vessels coming to join their doomed comrades. Nothing that would change the outcome of this battle. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. 17 signatures appeared on the screen, then 30 more, then 50, then 100. Ship after ship dropped out of hyperspace in a wall of metal and firepower that stretched across the void like an angry god. Earth's second fleet had arrived. Admiral Laura Simmons stood on the bridge of her flagship the Indomitable and surveyed the battlefield with cold fury. She was 63 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that could freeze water at 20 paces. She had been a soldier for 40 years. She had fought in wars that the history books tried to forget. She had buried more friends than she cared to count. 12 hours ago she had received a message from Captain Daniel Shaw. It was an unauthorized distress call sent on an encrypted channel that should not have reached her. The message was simple. We are engaging Corvan forces to protect civilian population. Request immediate reinforcement. We cannot hold forever. Laura had taken that message to her superiors. They had told her to stand down. The Galactic Council had forbidden intervention in this sector. Earth could not afford the diplomatic consequences of defying their orders. Laura had listened to every word. Then she had walked back to her ship and ordered her fleet to jump to hyperspace. The politicians would be furious. There would be hearings and investigations and possibly a court-martial. Laura did not care. She had not joined the military to sit by while innocent people died. She had not spent her life defending Earth just to abandon its values when they mattered most. All ships, she announced over the fleet frequency. Her voice was calm and steady and carried the weight of absolute authority. Weapons free. Light them up. 117 human warships opened fire at the same moment. The Corvan fleet had never faced anything like this. They had studied human military capabilities from a distance, and had concluded that this young species was no threat. Humans were newcomers to the galactic stage. Their technology was primitive by Corvan standards. Their ships were smaller and less heavily armed. What the Corvans had failed to understand was that humans did not fight fair. Earth's warships moved in patterns that seemed chaotic but were actually precisely coordinated. They attacked from multiple angles at once. They targeted engines and weapon systems with surgical accuracy. They covered each other and supported each other and fought as a single, unified force. The Corvan commanders tried to organize a defense, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. Human ships punched through their formation and tore it apart from the inside. Explosions blossomed across the void as Corvan vessels died one after another. Commander Xylith watched his fleet being destroyed and felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. All ships retreat, he ordered. Fall back to hyperspace. Get us out of here. But it was too late. Human vessels had surrounded his flagship. Their weapons were locked on his bridge. There was nowhere to run. On the planet's surface, Sergeant Ryan Cole heard the sonic booms before he saw the drop pods. They came down from the sky like metal rain. Hundreds of them, each one carrying fresh Marines with full ammunition and burning determination. The first reinforcements hit the ground running. They did not need orders. They did not need direction. They saw the enemy, and they attacked. Private First Class Lindsay Park was barely a month out of boot camp. She had trained for this moment her entire adult life, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of combat. The noise was deafening. The chaos was overwhelming. She saw things that would haunt her dreams for years to come. But she also saw something beautiful. She saw the surviving Marines of the first wave. The ones who had held the line for 6 impossible hours against overwhelming odds. They were exhausted and wounded, and barely standing. But when the reinforcements arrived, they did not fall back. They did not rest. They straightened their shoulders and raised their weapons and kept fighting. Lindsay found herself standing next to a man whose armor was covered in blood and burn marks. His face was pale from exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp and clear. She recognized his rank insignia. This was the legendary Sergeant Cole. "Is it always like this?" she asked. Her voice was shaking. Cole watched the Corvan forces breaking and running. The Crimson Guard, who had never known defeat, were retreating in chaos. Human soldiers chased them across the burning fields and cut them down without mercy. "No," he said quietly. "Sometimes it is worse." In orbit, the battle was ending. The Corvan fleet had been shattered. 27 of their 40 ships had been destroyed. The rest were either captured or fleeing into hyperspace. Commander Xylith had been taken prisoner and would face trial for war crimes. Admiral Simmons had her communications officer open a channel to the Resolute. The battered ship was barely holding together. Her hull was torn open in a dozen places. Her engines were failing. She was listing badly to one side. "Resolute, this is Admiral Simmons. What is your status?" Captain Daniel Shaw's voice came through the speaker. He sounded exhausted, but there was a note of relief underneath the weariness. "Admiral, we have taken severe damage, but we are still flying. Casualties among the crew are at 30%. The Marines on the surface have taken heavier losses, but the civilians are safe." "We held the line." Laura felt her throat tighten. She thought about what these people had done. 1 ship against 40. 48 Marines against thousands. They had known the odds. They had come anyway. "Well done, Captain. Rescue ships are on the way. Hold on just a little longer." "Understood, Admiral." "And sir, thank you for coming." Laura smiled despite the tears forming in her eyes. "Captain Shaw, I would not have missed this for the world." On the ground, the Valorian civilians were emerging from their shelters. They looked at the sky and saw human ships instead of Corvan ones. They looked at the ground and saw human soldiers standing guard instead of enemy troops. They did not understand how this had happened. They did not understand why strangers had come to die for them. Elder Voreth found Sergeant Cole sitting against a broken wall. The human soldier looked like he was about to collapse. But when the old Valorian approached, he pushed himself to his feet and stood at attention. "At ease, soldier," Voreth said. The words felt strange in his mouth. He had learned them from Megan Torres. You have done enough for one day. Cole shook his head slowly. Not yet, sir. Not until every one of your people is safe. Vorath stared at him for a long moment. Then he did something he had never done before. He bowed to a stranger. The humans had come. Against all odds and all reason they had come. And nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. 3 days after the battle, the fires were finally out and the dead had been buried. The Valorian colonists had emerged from their shelters to find a world transformed. Human engineers were already at work, rebuilding the homes that had been destroyed. Medical teams moved through the population, treating wounds and distributing supplies. Transport ships brought food and medicine and seeds for replanting the fields that had been burned. In the center of the colony, a group of human soldiers were teaching Valorian children how to play a game called soccer. The children did not fully understand the rules, but they laughed as they chased the ball across the field. It was the first laughter anyone had heard in this place for weeks. Captain Daniel Shaw had been ordered to report to the flagship for a debriefing, but he had asked for 1 more hour on the surface first. He found a quiet hill overlooking the colony and sat down to watch the sunset. The sky turned orange and purple as the stars sank below the horizon. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. He thought about the people he had lost. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Price had died when a power conduit exploded on the bridge. 12 other crew members had not survived the battle. Their names were already being engraved on a memorial wall back on Earth. He thought about the Marines who had given their lives. Derek Huang from Nebraska. Amy Lin, who had kept fighting with one arm. Marcus Webb, who had died saving his friends. So many young faces that would never grow old. Had it been worth it? The politicians would say no. The diplomats would say no. The Galactic Council had already issued a formal condemnation of Earth's actions. Sanctions were being discussed. Trade agreements were being reconsidered. But 8,000 people were alive who would have been dead without them. 8,000 people who would have families and children and grandchildren. 8,000 futures that had been saved because someone decided to help. Daniel thought that was worth something. Footsteps approached from behind and he turned to see Elder Vorath climbing the hill. The old Valorian moved slowly, but his eyes were brighter than they had been days ago. He came to stand beside the human captain and looked out at the colony below. Captain Shaw, Elder Vorath, how can I help you? The old alien was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be searching for words that did not exist in his language. The Galactic Council is furious, he said finally. They say Earth violated 17 diplomatic protocols. They say there will be sanctions and embargoes and consequences. Your leaders may face punishment for what they have done here. Daniel nodded slowly. Probably. And yet you came anyway. All of you. Knowing the price. Daniel looked at the sunset. The colors were fading now as darkness crept across the sky. Stars were beginning to appear overhead. Somewhere up there his ship was being repaired. Somewhere up there his crew was waiting for him. Somewhere up there the galaxy was watching to see what would happen next. Yes, he said simply. We came anyway. Vorath turned to face him fully. His old eyes were glistening with emotion that Daniel did not fully understand. My people tell stories of the old protectors. Beings who guarded the weak and stood against darkness when all others fled. We tell our children these tales, but we know they are just myths. We know that in the real universe the strong take what they want and the weak suffer. That is the way of things. That is how it has always been. He paused and seemed to gather himself. But then you came. You fell from the sky with your weapons and your courage, and you stood between us and death. You asked for nothing. You expected nothing. You simply could not bear to watch us die. Daniel felt uncomfortable with the reverence in the elder's voice. He thought about all the things he could say. He could talk about duty and honor and the traditions of Earth's military. He could quote regulations and mission parameters and chains of command. He could make it sound clean and simple and official. But that was not the truth. The truth was messier than that. We are not protectors or myths, he said honestly. We are just people. People who could not sleep at night knowing we had done nothing while innocents suffered. He turned to face Vorath directly. He extended his hand in a gesture that the Valorian would not recognize but somehow seemed to understand. We are neighbors, he said. and neighbors help each other. Vorath clasped the offered hand with both of his own. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so old. Then we are fortunate indeed to have such neighbors. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire through dry grass. The humans had defied the council. They had saved a colony that no one else would touch. They had bled and died for strangers, and when asked why, their answer had been simple: because no one else was coming. In the halls of 100 civilizations, beings whispered to one another. They spoke of Earth with new respect. They spoke of humans with new fear. This young species from a violent and beautiful world had proven something that many had forgotten was possible. They had proven that compassion could be stronger than self-interest. They had proven that courage could triumph over impossible odds. They had proven that some things were worth fighting for even when the cost was high. On a dozen forgotten worlds, oppressed peoples heard the story and felt something stir in their hearts. Hope. For the first time in generations, they dared to hope that someone might come for them too. That somewhere in the vast darkness of space, there were beings who cared about more than profit and power. The Korvan Empire issued threats and demands, but their words rang hollow. They had faced humanity in battle, and they had lost. Their undefeated Crimson Guard had been broken. Their fleet had been shattered. Their commander was a prisoner awaiting trial. They would not make the mistake of underestimating humans again. Months later, a memorial was built on Nexara 7. It stood in the center of the colony where the shelter dome had once been. The names of every human who had died in the battle were carved into its surface. Flowers and offerings were left at its base by grateful Valorians who would never forget what had been done for them. At the top of the memorial was a simple inscription in both human and Valorian languages. They came when no one else would. They fought when all seemed lost. They fell from the sky like angels of war, and the darkness learned to fear the light. In memory of the brave souls of Earth who died so that strangers might live, Elder Vorath visited the memorial every day until his death many years later. He would stand before it and remember the day the sky had opened and warriors had fallen from above. He would remember a young woman named Megan, who had smiled at him and said that someone had to help. He would remember that in a universe of cold calculation and ruthless ambition, there was still room for something better. There was still room for humanity. And somewhere in the stars, new signals were being sent. New distress calls from new worlds in need. And somewhere on Earth, commanders were reading those signals and making difficult decisions. The galaxy had learned something important that day on Nexara 7. When the darkness comes and all hope seems lost, there is a species that will answer the call. There is a species that will cross the void to stand with the fallen. Earth's warriors were watching. And they would come again.